In the heart of a busy city, where people rushed past each other with their heads down and earphones plugged in, two women were about to have an encounter that neither of them expected. The cafe on the corner was warm and inviting, filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of conversations. It wasn't the kind of place you'd imagine a life-changing moment happening, but sometimes those moments choose ordinary settings. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her usual spot near the window, sipping her latte and scrolling through her phone. She liked this cafe because it gave her space to think without distractions. Known for her quick wit and no-nonsense attitude, she had spent years challenging ideas and poking fun at things others took seriously. Her humor was sharp, often edgy, but always rooted in truth, or at least what she believed to be true. On this particular afternoon, though, she wasn't here to entertain anyone. She just wanted some quiet time before heading to a meeting later in the day. As she glanced up from her phone, she noticed someone walking into the cafe. This person stood out, not because they were flashy or loud, but because there was something calm and intentional about the way they moved. They wore simple clothes, but around their neck hung a small silver cross necklace that caught the light as they stepped inside. Whoopi's eyes narrowed slightly. She recognized the symbol instantly. It meant faith, religion, belief systems, things she didn't shy away from questioning. Without thinking too much about it, Whoopi let out a soft laugh under her breath. "Oh, great," she muttered sarcastically, half to herself. "Another one here to save the world." Her words weren't mean-spirited, not exactly, but they carried a hint of mockery. She'd met plenty of people like this before. Those who talked endlessly about their faith, convinced they had all the answers. To her, it often felt like they were trying too hard to prove something to everyone else instead of living their lives quietly. The person, who would soon introduce herself as Karoline Leavitt, heard the comment. It wasn't hard to miss. Whoopi's voice carried just enough to reach her ears. For a second she froze, unsure how to react. Most people would have been offended or walked away, but Karoline wasn't most people. Instead of ignoring the remark or storming off, she did something surprising. She smiled. Not a forced or fake smile, but a genuine one, like she understood where Whoopi was coming from even if she didn't agree with it. With steady steps, Karoline approached the table where Whoopi sat. There was no hesitation in her movements, only confidence mixed with kindness. "Hi," she said softly, standing beside the chair opposite Whoopi. "Mind if I sit?" Whoopi looked up, raising an eyebrow. She hadn't expected this reaction. Normally, when she made comments like that, people either got defensive or avoided her altogether, but this woman? She seemed different. Shrugging nonchalantly, Whoopi gestured toward the empty seat. "Be my guest," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Just don't try to convert me while we're at it." Karoline chuckled lightly as she sat down, placing her bag on the floor beside her. "Don't worry," she replied, her tone warm and friendly. "I'm not here to convince anyone of anything. I just thought maybe we could talk. For real, you know?" Whoopi tilted her head slightly, intrigued despite herself. "Talk about what?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. "Faith, hope, all that stuff you probably spend hours preaching about?" Karoline nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, maybe. But not because I want to change your mind, because I think stories matter. And if sharing mine helps someone see the world a little differently, even just for a moment, then it's worth it." At this point, Whoopi couldn't help but smirk. She appreciated honesty, even when it came wrapped in idealism. Still, she wasn't ready to give in completely. "Stories are nice," she admitted, shrugging again. "But they don't pay the bills, do they? Faith might make you feel good, but what happens when reality hits?" Karoline didn't flinch at the question. In fact, she seemed to expect it. Taking a deep breath, she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "You're right," she said simply. "Faith doesn't fix everything overnight, but it gives you strength to keep going when nothing else makes sense. That's why I believe in it, not because it solves every problem, but because it reminds me I'm not alone." Her words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Whoopi stared at her for a long moment, searching for any sign of pretense or exaggeration. but all she saw was sincerity, a quiet certainty that couldn't easily be shaken. For the first time in a while, she found herself unsure of what to say next, and so their conversation began, not as a debate or argument, but as a meeting of two very different perspectives. Neither knew yet how much this interaction would challenge them, inspire them, or leave them reflecting long after the coffee cups were emptied. But one thing was clear. This was more than just a random meeting in a cafe. It was the start of something unexpected. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, studying the woman sitting across from her. There was something about the way she spoke, calm, steady, and without any hint of defensiveness, that made Whoopi pause. She wasn't used to this kind of reaction. Most people either tried too hard to prove their point or got rattled when challenged. But this woman? She seemed comfortable just being present, like she had nothing to lose by having this conversation. "Okay," Whoopi said finally, breaking the silence with a playful smirk. "Let's say I humor you for a minute. What exactly does faith do for you? Like, how does believing in whatever it is you believe in actually help in real life?" Karoline smiled faintly, as if she'd been waiting for this question all along. She didn't rush to answer. Instead, she took a sip of water from the glass on the table, giving herself a moment to think. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet confidence that caught Whoopi off guard. "It gives me hope," Karoline said simply. "Not the kind of hope where you sit around wishing things will get better. I'm talking about the kind that pushes you to keep going, even when everything feels impossible." Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Hope sounds nice," she shot back, leaning forward slightly. "But let's be real here. Hope doesn't pay rent. It doesn't cure diseases. It doesn't fix broken relationships. So what good?" "Is it really?" Karoline nodded slowly, acknowledging the challenge in Whoopi's tone. "You're right," she admitted. "Hope alone can't solve problems, but it keeps you standing when you feel like falling apart. And sometimes that's enough to make a difference, not just for me, but for others too." Whoopi crossed her arms over her chest, still unconvinced. "Others? You mean like helping people or something?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Exactly. Helping someone else, even in small ways, can change their whole day, maybe even their life. My faith reminds me that I don't have to wait for perfect circumstances to do good. I can start right where I am with what I have." At this, Whoopi couldn't help but laugh, a short, sharp burst of amusement. "Wow, that's some serious optimism you've got there. Do you ever get tired of being so cheery?" To her surprise, Karoline laughed too. "Oh, absolutely," she admitted with a grin. "I'm not saying I wake up every morning ready to save the world. Some days, I barely want to get out of bed, but knowing I'm part of something bigger than myself, it helps me push through those tough moments." Whoopi studied her face carefully, trying to gauge whether she was being genuine or putting on a show. Everything about Karoline, the steady gaze, the calm demeanor, the lack of hesitation in her words, suggested authenticity. Still, Whoopi wasn't ready to let go of her skepticism entirely. "All right, fine," Whoopi said after a beat, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's say I buy this whole hope thing for a second. Give me an example, something real. Not some vague story about rainbows and sunshine." Karoline didn't hesitate. She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table as she began to speak. Her voice softened, becoming more reflective, like she was pulling memories straight from her heart. "A few years ago, I met a single mom at a community center where I volunteered. She was struggling, working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table while raising 3 kids on her own. She felt invisible, like no one cared about what she was going through. One day, she came in looking completely drained. You could see it in her eyes. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was close to giving up." Whoopi listened intently now, her usual sarcasm tempered by curiosity. She hadn't expected such a specific story, especially one that sounded so raw and personal. "I didn't have much to offer her," Karoline continued. "No money, no magic solutions, but I sat with her for a while, listened to her talk about her fears and frustrations. Just letting her know she wasn't alone meant something to her. Later, I connected her with resources from my church, groceries, childcare support, things like that. It wasn't much, but it helped ease some of the pressure she was under. She paused, glancing down at her hands for a moment before looking back up at Whoopi. Months later, she came back to thank me. She told me that simple act of kindness had reminded her she wasn't fighting alone. That gave her the strength to keep going, to believe things could improve. Today, she's doing better. Got a stable job, her kids are thriving. None of that would have happened without someone stepping in, even in a small way. The cafe grew quieter around them as Karoline finished speaking. Whoopi sat motionless, her usual quick wit momentarily silenced. The story wasn't dramatic or overly polished. It was real, messy, and human, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, it stuck with her. "You really believe that stuff, don't you?" Whoopi asked eventually, her voice softer than before. There was no mockery in her tone this time, only genuine curiosity. Karoline nodded. "I do," she replied simply, "because I've seen it work. Not just for me, but for others too. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that even when things seem hopeless, there's still a reason to keep moving forward." For a long moment, Whoopi said nothing. She stared at the tabletop, lost in thought. This wasn't the kind of conversation she usually had. People tended to agree with her or argue back, but rarely did they sit across from her and share something so deeply personal. It made her uncomfortable in a way she hadn't anticipated, but also intrigued. Finally, she looked up, meeting Karoline's gaze directly. "You're tougher than you look," she said with a slight smirk, though there was no malice behind. Most people would have walked away after my first comment. Karoline chuckled softly. "Maybe. But running away doesn't solve anything either. Besides," she added with a playful glint in her eye, "you didn't scare me off that easily." Whoopi laughed despite herself shaking her head. "Fair enough," she conceded. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "So what now? Are we done swapping life stories, or do you have more surprises up your sleeve?" Karoline grinned, leaning back in her chair. "Depends. Are you ready to hear them?" The two women exchanged a glance, and for the first time, there was a sense of connection between them, a mutual respect that hadn't been there before. Their conversation wasn't over yet, but already, they both knew it had shifted into something deeper. Whoopi leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her signature smirk softened into something more thoughtful as she looked at Karoline. "All right," she said, her tone lighter but still laced with skepticism. "Let's say I play along a little longer. Tell me this. What happens when hope isn't enough? What do you do when even your faith can't fix things?" Karoline didn't flinch. She seemed to expect the question, her calm demeanor unwavering. "That's the hard part," she admitted, her voice steady but tinged with honesty. "There are moments when it feels like nothing works, when no amount of faith or hope changes the outcome. I've been there too." She paused, glancing out the window for a moment before turning back to Whoopi. "But here's what I've learned. Faith doesn't promise that everything will turn out perfectly. It just reminds me to keep moving forward, even when I don't see the finish line. Sometimes that's all we can do." Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Keep moving forward," she repeated slowly, testing the phrase in her mind. "Sounds easy enough to say, but how does that actually work in real life? People talk about resilience and perseverance, but when you're staring down failure, or worse, loss, it's not exactly simple to bounce back." Karoline nodded, understanding the weight behind Whoopi's words. "It's not simple," she agreed. "In fact, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done. But let me tell you another story, one where keeping going felt almost impossible." Whoopi crossed her arms over her chest, settling deeper into her chair. "All right, hit me with it," she said, her tone half challenging, half curious. Something about the way Karoline spoke drew her in, making her want to hear more, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. Karoline took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "A few years ago, I lost someone very close to me," she began, her voice quieter now but still strong. "My best friend passed away suddenly, We were inseparable, and losing her felt like losing a piece of myself. For months I couldn't function. I questioned everything, my purpose, my beliefs, even whether anything I did mattered anymore. Whoopi listened intently, her usual sharp wit momentarily subdued. There was something raw and unfiltered about the way Karoline shared her pain, and it resonated deeply. Loss was universal, everyone had faced it in some form, yet hearing someone articulate their struggle so openly made it feel fresh, new, and undeniably human. I remember sitting alone one night, crying until I thought I had no tears left. Karoline continued. I felt angry, at the world, at God, at myself. Why hadn't I seen the signs? Could I have done something to prevent it? The questions kept coming, and the answers never came. She paused, looking down at her hands clasped tightly around the coffee mug. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet strength. But then, one day, I realized something. My friend wouldn't have wanted me to stop living because she was gone. She always encouraged me to chase my dreams, to help others, to make a difference. Staying stuck in grief wasn't honoring her memory, it was wasting it. Whoopi's expression softened further, her defenses lowering bit by bit. So what did you do? She asked, her curiosity genuine now. Karoline smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and determination in her eyes. I started small. I volunteered at a local shelter, something my friend and I used to talk about doing together. At first, it wasn't about helping anyone else. It was about finding a reason to get out of bed each morning. But over time, those small steps added up. Helping others reminded me why life matters, even when it hurts. Whoopi sat quietly for a moment, processing the story. She'd heard plenty of tales of loss and redemption, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the honesty in Karoline's voice, or maybe it was the fact that she wasn't trying to sell anything, not religion, not philosophy, just her truth. Whatever it was, it struck a chord. You know, Whoopi said finally, breaking the silence, most people would have crumbled under that kind of pain. Hell, I probably would have. How'd you manage to pull yourself together? Karoline shrugged slightly, her smile warm but tinged with humility.
Honestly, I didn't do it alone. Faith gave me something to hold on to when everything else felt shaky. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave me a reason to keep breathing. And honestly, the people around me, the ones who showed up, who
listened, who cared, they made all the difference too. Whoopi chuckled softly, shaking her head. You're full of surprises, aren't you? Just when I think I've got you figured out, you throw another curveball. Karoline laughed lightly, her shoulders relaxing. Life's full of curveballs. I'm just learning to catch them better these days. The two women shared a brief laugh, the tension between them melting away. For the first time since they'd met, it felt less like a debate and more like a conversation, two people sharing pieces of themselves without judgment or pretense. After a moment, Whoopi leaned back in her chair, her expression contemplative. All right, I'll give you this much. You've got guts. Most folks in your position would have walked away after my first jab. But you stuck around, kept talking. Why? Karoline tilted her head slightly, considering the question. Because I believe in connection, she answered simply. Not everyone will agree with me, and that's okay. But if I can share my perspective and maybe understand yours a little better, then it's worth it. Conversations like this, they matter. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed despite herself. Well, aren't you just full of wisdom today? She teased, her trademark humor returning. But there was warmth behind her words now, a hint of admiration creeping through. Karoline grinned, unfazed by the playful jab. Wisdom, huh? I'll take that as a compliment. Their conversation flowed naturally from there, shifting from heavy topics to lighter ones. They talked about their favorite books, movies, and even shared a few laughs over childhood memories. As the afternoon wore on, the cafe filled with the sounds of clinking cups and muffled chatter, but neither woman paid much attention. They were too busy connecting, too engrossed in the exchange of ideas and experiences. Eventually, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light through the windows. Whoopi glanced at her watch, realizing the time had slipped away faster than she'd expected. "Looks like I've got to head out soon," she said, standing up and stretching slightly. Meetings wait for no one, apparently. Karoline stood as well, offering a friendly smile. "Thanks for sticking around," she said sincerely. "I know I probably wasn't what you were expecting when you walked in here today." Whoopi smirked, grabbing her bag from the chair. "You're definitely not what I expected," she admitted. "But hey, life's boring when everything goes according to plan, right?" They exchanged a final glance, both knowing this encounter had changed something within them. For Whoopi, it was a reminder that people are rarely as predictable as they seem. For Karoline, it was proof that even the toughest hearts can open up if given the chance. As they parted ways outside the cafe, neither woman could shake the feeling that their paths crossing hadn't been random. Sometimes conversations happen, not because they need to, but because they're meant to. And sometimes those conversations leave ripples that last far beyond the moment itself. As Whoopi stepped out of the cafe, the cool evening air hit her face, snapping her back to reality. She paused for a moment on the sidewalk, glancing over her shoulder at Karoline, who was still standing by the door. There was something about this whole encounter that lingered in her mind, refusing to fade away. It wasn't just the stories or the way Karoline spoke. It was the way she carried herself, like she genuinely believed every word she said without needing anyone else to agree. "You're not going to try to convince me to join your church or anything, are you?" Whoopi asked with a teasing grin, breaking the quiet between them. Her tone was light, but there was an underlying curiosity beneath the joke. Karoline laughed softly, shaking her head. "Nope. No pressure here. I told you before. I'm not here to change minds. Just hearts, maybe." Whoopi raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the distinction. "Hearts, huh? That's a bold claim. You think you can do that?" "I don't think I can," Karoline replied honestly, meeting Whoopi's gaze. "But I believe people have the power to touch each other's lives in ways they don't always expect. Sometimes all it takes is one honest conversation." Whoopi smirked, crossing her arms over her chest as she leaned casually against the railing outside the cafe. "All right, philosopher. Let's say I buy into this touching hearts theory for a second. What makes you so sure conversations like ours actually matter? People talk all the time, half the time they don't even listen." Karoline nodded thoughtfully, clearly expecting the question. "You're right. They often don't. But when someone truly listens, really hears what another person is saying, it changes things. Even if it's just for a moment, it reminds us we're not alone. And sometimes, that reminder is enough to keep someone going when they feel like giving up." Her words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Whoopi tilted her head slightly, studying Karoline's expression. There was no arrogance in her voice, no attempt to prove she was smarter or wiser. Just honesty and a quiet confidence that came from lived experience. "Not bad," Whoopi admitted after a pause, her usual sarcasm softened by genuine respect. "Most folks would have tried to argue their point until they were blue in the face. But you're different. You let the words breathe." Karoline smiled warmly, shrugging modestly. "Maybe because I know I don't have all the answers. None of us do. But I also know that sharing our stories matters. Even the messy ones. They remind us we're human." Whoopi chuckled under her breath, shaking her head slightly. "Human, huh? Yeah, that's one thing we definitely are. Messy, complicated, and full of contradictions. Don't think faith fixes that, though." "It doesn't," Karoline agreed quickly, surprising Whoopi with her directness. "Faith doesn't make life perfect or easy. If anything, it highlights how broken things can be. But it gives me a lens to see the cracks, not as failures, but as places where healing starts." Whoopi frowned slightly, turning the idea over in her mind. She'd spent years poking fun at religion and challenging its followers, but this take was new to her. Most people she'd met used faith as a shield, a way to avoid confronting pain or uncertainty. Karoline, on the other hand, seemed to embrace the messiness of life while still holding on to hope. It was refreshing. "So what?" Whoopi asked finally, her tone more curious than confrontational. You're saying faith helps you deal with the hard stuff instead of running away from it? In a way, yes, Karoline replied, her voice steady. It's not about ignoring the pain or pretending everything's fine. It's about finding strength to face it head on, even when you're scared. And knowing you're not facing it alone, that makes a difference. Whoopi exhaled slowly, letting the words sink in. She'd been through her own share of struggles, moments when the weight of the world felt unbearable. While she'd never relied on faith to get through those times, she couldn't deny the value of having something, or someone, to lean on. Maybe that was why Karoline's perspective resonated with her, even if she didn't fully agree with it. After a long pause, Whoopi straightened up, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "All right, preacher," she said with a playful smirk. "Let me ask you one last thing. Why does any of this matter to you? Why go out of your way to help strangers or sit down with someone like me who's clearly skeptical of everything you stand for?" Karoline hesitated for a moment, her smile fading into a thoughtful expression. When she spoke again, her voice carried a depth that caught Whoopi off guard. "Because I've been on the other side," she admitted quietly. "There were times in my life when I felt invisible, like no one cared whether I succeeded or failed. Someone reached out to me during one of those dark periods, not because they wanted anything from me, but because they saw me. Really saw me." She paused, looking down at her hands briefly before continuing. "That changed everything for me. So now, I try to pay it forward. Not because I owe anyone, but because I know what it feels like to be seen when you least expect it. To feel like you matter, even when you doubt it yourself." Whoopi stared at her for a moment, struck by the sincerity in her voice. This wasn't some rehearsed speech or polished sermon. It was raw, real, and deeply personal. For the first time in a long while, she found herself at a loss for words. "Well," Whoopi said finally, clearing her throat to break the silence. "You're tougher than I gave you credit for. Thought you'd crack under pressure, but here we are." Karoline laughed lightly, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Guess I surprised both of us then." Whoopi grinned, shaking her head. "Yeah, you did. All right, listen. You're late for whatever meeting you've got lined up, and I should probably head to mine too. But hey," she paused, pointing a finger at Karoline playfully, "don't go thinking this means I'm signing up for Sunday service anytime soon, okay?" Karoline laughed again, nodding emphatically. "Wouldn't dream of it. But if you ever need someone to talk to about anything, you know where to find me." Whoopi smirked, tipping an imaginary hat in her direction. "Thanks for the invite. Now, don't go getting all mushy on me. We're still practically strangers." "Strangers who shared coffee and stories," Karoline corrected gently, her smile warm and genuine, and maybe, just maybe, walked away a little better for it. With that, they parted ways, heading in opposite directions. The city buzzed around them, oblivious to the quiet connection that had formed between two very different women. For Whoopi, the encounter left her questioning things she hadn't thought about in years, things she wasn't sure she wanted to explore further. For Karoline, it reinforced her belief in the power of conversation, even with those who challenged her beliefs. Neither woman realized it at the time, but their brief meeting would stay with them long after the sun set and the cafe closed its doors. Conversations like theirs rarely end neatly. They linger, growing roots in unexpected places, shaping perspectives in ways neither party anticipates. And sometimes, that's exactly what makes them so meaningful. The next day, Whoopi found herself replaying snippets of the cafe conversation in her mind. She wasn't sure why it stuck with her so much. Maybe it was Karoline's calm demeanor, or maybe it was the way she spoke about faith without trying to shove it down anyone's throat. Whatever it was, Whoopi couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. She sat in her dressing room, scrolling through emails on her phone, while a makeup artist worked on her face for an upcoming show. Normally, she'd be cracking jokes or chatting casually, but today, she was unusually quiet. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Karoline's words. "Faith doesn't fix everything. It just reminds you you're not alone." The phrase echoed in her head like a song lyric she couldn't unhear. Was there truth to it? Or was it just another line people used to justify their beliefs? Whoopi didn't know, and that uncertainty bothered her. She prided herself on being someone who questioned everything, who refused to accept things at face value. But this time she couldn't dismiss it as easily. Her assistant knocked lightly on the door before peeking her head in. "Hey, we've got 5 minutes before you're live," she said cheerfully. "You good?" Whoopi glanced up, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." The assistant raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the rare admission. "About what?" Whoopi hesitated, then shrugged nonchalantly. "Life, I guess, faith, hope, all that mushy stuff nobody talks about unless they're trying to sell you something." Her assistant chuckled, leaning against the doorway. "Sounds deep. Anything specific spark this existential crisis?" Whoopi smirked, waving her hand dismissively. "Nah, nothing major. Just met someone yesterday who made me think twice about, well, everything." Curiosity lit up the assistant's face. "Oh? Do tell." Whoopi sighed, setting her phone down on the table. "It's complicated. This woman, I don't even know her last name, and I ended up talking at a cafe. She was all about faith and hope, the usual spiel. But here's the thing. She didn't preach, didn't try to convince me of anything, just shared her story like it mattered. And weirdly enough, it did." The assistant tilted her head, intrigued. "What kind of stories?" Whoopi leaned back in her chair, letting the makeup artist finish blending foundation along her jawline. "Real ones. Not the polished Instagram-worthy kind. She talked about losing someone close to her, about how she almost gave up but found a reason to keep going. Said faith helped her see the cracks, not as failures, but as places where healing starts." The assistant nodded slowly, absorbing the details. "That's actually pretty powerful. Did you believe her?" Whoopi frowned slightly, considering the question. "I don't know if believe is the right word. I mean, I believed her, sure. She seemed sincere. But does that mean I buy into the whole faith thing? No, at least, not yet." Her assistant grinned mischievously. "Yet? So you're saying there's a chance?" Whoopi rolled her eyes, though a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Don't push it. I'm just saying she made me think. Most people get defensive when I challenge them, but she didn't. She listened. Really listened. And honestly, that's rare." The assistant laughed softly, shaking her head. "Well, sounds like you've got your own little life lesson brewing here. Maybe you should write a book or something." Whoopi snorted, rolling her eyes again. "Right. Because the world needs another self-help guru." "No, seriously," the assistant pressed, her tone teasing but earnest. "People love hearing about real moments like that. You could turn it into a segment. It'd kill on social media." Whoopi paused, mulling over the idea. While she wasn't ready to dive headfirst into discussing faith on national television, the thought of sharing part of the conversation intrigued her. Not because she wanted to promote anything, but because it felt authentic, raw, human. "Maybe," she said finally, shrugging. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I've still got a show to do." Later that evening, after wrapping up filming, Whoopi decided to take a walk through the city streets. The cool night air cleared her head, allowing her thoughts to wander freely. As she strolled past bustling restaurants and quiet alleyways, she noticed a familiar figure standing near a bus stop. It was Karoline. For a moment, Whoopi debated whether to approach her. After all, their previous meeting had been unexpected, a random collision of worlds. Did fate really intend for them to cross paths again so soon? Shaking off the thought, she walked over anyway, curiosity getting the better of her. "Fancy seeing you here," Whoopi said casually, stopping beside Karoline with a playful grin. Karoline turned, startled at first, but then broke into a wide smile when she recognized who it was. "Wow. Talk about coincidence. What are the odds?" Whoopi shrugged, leaning against the metal railing of the bus stop. "Beats me. Guess the universe has a sense of humor." They stood there for a moment, exchanging pleasantries and catching up briefly. Eventually, the conversation turned back to the topic they'd discussed the day before: faith, hope, and the messy beauty of life. "You ever wonder why some conversations stick with you?" Whoopi asked suddenly, her tone more serious than usual. Like you meet someone for 10 minutes and years later you're still thinking about what they said? Karoline nodded thoughtfully. All the time. I think it happens when someone shares a piece of themselves, their real selves, with you. Those moments leave marks even if we don't realize it right away. Whoopi exhaled slowly, staring out at the streetlights reflecting off puddles left by earlier rain. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yesterday I walked away from our chat feeling unsettled, like you'd thrown a rock into the pond of my brain and the ripples haven't stopped yet. Karoline chuckled softly, though her expression remained kind. Unsettled isn't always bad. Sometimes it means you're growing. Whoopi glanced at her sideways, raising an eyebrow. Growing, huh? That's one way to put it. Feels more like confusion if you ask me. Confusion can lead to clarity, Karoline countered gently. As long as you're willing to sit with the questions instead of rushing for answers. Whoopi smirked, shaking her head. You're full of these little nuggets of wisdom, aren't you? Bet you've got a whole library of quotes memorized. Karoline laughed, holding up her hands defensively, guilty as charged. But trust me, it's not about sounding smart, it's about surviving. When life gets tough, sometimes words are all you've got to hold on to. Whoopi studied her for a moment, struck once again by the sincerity in her voice. There was no pretense, no attempt to impress, just honesty, and a quiet strength that came from weathering storms most people wouldn't dare face. You're all right, you know that? Whoopi said finally, her tone softer than before. Most people would have given up on me after my first sarcastic comment. But you stuck around. Karoline smiled warmly, shrugging modestly. Because I knew you were worth it. Everyone deserves to be heard, even when they're skeptical. Whoopi chuckled under her breath, shaking her head slightly. All right, preacher. Don't go making me sound like some charity case now. I wouldn't dream of it, Karoline replied, laughing lightly. But hey, if you ever need someone to listen, you know where to find me. Whoopi nodded, tipping an imaginary hat in her direction. Thanks. I'll keep that in mind. As the bus pulled up to the stop, Karoline picked up her bag and stepped toward the door. Before boarding, she turned back to Whoopi with a final smile. Take care of yourself, okay? Keep asking those big questions. They matter more than you think. With that, she disappeared onto the bus, leaving Whoopi standing alone on the sidewalk. For a moment, she watched the taillights fade into the distance, lost in thought. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and started walking home, the weight of the conversation settling comfortably in her chest. Sometimes connections form in the most unexpected places, and sometimes they stay with us long after the moment has passed, shaping us in ways we never anticipated. The following morning, Whoopi woke up with a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't the kind of epiphany where everything suddenly made sense. Life was far too complicated for that. But there was a shift, subtle yet undeniable, in how she viewed the world around her. She found herself replaying not just Karoline's words, but also her demeanor, calm, patient, and unshakable. That quiet confidence stuck with her, like a melody she couldn't stop humming. As she sipped her coffee at the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the city skyline, she realized something surprising. For years, she'd prided herself on being skeptical, on questioning every idea or belief system that came her way. Skepticism had been her armor, protecting her from blind acceptance or emotional manipulation. Yet now, for the first time in a long while, she wondered if maybe skepticism wasn't enough. What good was doubting everything if it left you feeling disconnected? Her phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from her assistant reminding her about an upcoming interview segment later that day. Normally, she'd dive right into prep work, brushing off any lingering reflections as irrelevant distractions. Today, though, she hesitated. Instead of jumping straight into her usual routine, she sat there for a few extra minutes, letting her mind wander. By mid-afternoon, she was back in the studio, seated across from a guest who was promoting their latest book, a self-help guide filled with motivational quotes and promises of personal transformation. The author smiled brightly, radiating enthusiasm as they explained why readers needed to find their purpose and embrace positivity. Whoopi listened politely, nodding along at all the right moments, but inside she felt restless. When it came time for questions, she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "So," she began, her tone casual but probing, "you talk a lot about finding purpose and staying positive. But what happens when life doesn't cooperate? When no amount of affirmations or journaling fixes your problems?" The author blinked, caught off guard by the question. They recovered quickly, launching into a rehearsed response about resilience and perseverance, but Whoopi wasn't satisfied. She pressed further, her curiosity genuine this time. Yeah, I get that. Keep pushing forward, all that jazz. But let's be real. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, things still fall apart. So then what? How do people keep going when hope feels impossible? The room fell silent for a beat, the cameras rolling silently as everyone waited for the author's answer. Unfortunately, the response was vague, a mix of cliches and platitudes that didn't quite land. As the segment wrapped up, Whoopi thanked the guest graciously, maintaining her professional demeanor. But internally she felt frustrated. Their answers lacked depth, the kind of authenticity she'd experienced during her conversation with Karoline. After the show ended, her producer approached her, clipboard in hand. "Great job today," he said cheerfully. "You really dug deep with those questions." Whoopi shrugged, leaning back in her chair. "I don't know if great is the word I'd use. Felt more like we were skimming the surface instead of actually saying something meaningful." Her producer raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" She sighed, rubbing her temples lightly. "I mean, these kinds of topics, hope, faith, purpose, they're big, complicated. People throw around words like they're magic spells, but they don't always explain how to live through the tough stuff. Like, yeah, tell me to stay positive, but what if I'm not feeling it? What then?" Her producer nodded slowly, clearly understanding her frustration. "You've got a point. Maybe it's because most folks aren't willing to go there, to talk about the messy parts of life. Too uncomfortable." "Exactly," Whoopi agreed, sitting up straighter. "And that's the problem. If we're going to have conversations about hope or faith or whatever, we need to acknowledge the pain too. Otherwise, it's just empty words." Her producer chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well, leave it to you to call out the elephant in the room. You should pitch a segment on this, something raw, real, something that challenges people to think differently." Whoopi smirked, raising an eyebrow. "You trying to turn me into Oprah now?" He laughed, holding up his hands defensively. "Nope, just saying, you've got a unique perspective. And judging by the way you've been talking lately, it sounds like you've got some thoughts worth sharing." She considered his suggestion for a moment, letting the idea roll around in her mind. Could she take something as personal as her recent conversation with Karoline and turn it into a larger discussion? Part of her hesitated. It felt risky, exposing a side of herself she rarely showed publicly. But another part of her recognized the potential impact. Maybe others felt the same disconnect she did, searching for meaning without finding satisfying answers. Later that evening, after leaving the studio, Whoopi decided to visit the cafe again. It had become a sort of sanctuary for her over the past few days, a place where she could process her thoughts without distraction. She ordered her usual latte and settled into the same corner seat near the window. As she sipped her drink, she pulled out her notebook and began jotting down ideas. At first, the notes were scattered, random phrases and half-formed thoughts about faith, doubt, and resilience. Slowly, however, a theme started to emerge. She titled the page "Unanswered Questions" and wrote at the top, "What keeps us moving forward when nothing makes sense?" She worked quietly for nearly an hour, lost in her own reflections. When she finally looked up, she noticed someone familiar. Walking through the door, it was Karoline again, this time carrying a tote bag and wearing a warm scarf draped loosely around her neck. Their eyes met briefly, and Karoline smiled, heading toward the counter to order her coffee. After grabbing her drink, she glanced over at Whoopi and hesitated for a moment before approaching her table. "Mind if I join you?" Karoline asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Whoopi grinned, closing her notebook and setting it aside. "Sure thing." Didn't think I'd see you here again so soon. Karoline laughed softly as she sat down. Funny how life works, huh? Guess fate likes throwing us together. Whoopi tilted her head, studying her face thoughtfully. Or maybe it's just coincidence. Either way, I'm glad you stopped by. They spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing. This time, the conversation flowed even more naturally than before. There was no agenda, no pressure to prove a point. Just two people sharing their perspectives, learning from each other. At one point, Whoopi brought up the idea of turning her recent musings into a project, a series of interviews or discussions exploring the complexities of faith, hope, and humanity. To her surprise, Karoline lit up at the concept. That's incredible, Karoline said earnestly. People crave real conversations, especially about the hard stuff. If anyone can pull that off, it's you. Whoopi smirked, shaking her head. Don't get too excited, I'm still figuring it out. But yeah, maybe there's something to it. Karoline nodded, her expression thoughtful. Just remember, you don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes asking the right questions is enough. Whoopi chuckled, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. Spoken like a true philosopher, thanks for the pep talk. As the evening wore on, the cafe grew quieter, the hum of conversation fading into the background. Eventually, they both stood to leave, exchanging smiles and promises to stay in touch. Walking home later, Whoopi felt lighter, like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had lifted. Conversations like this reminded her of what mattered most, not having all the answers but connecting deeply with others while searching for them together. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Whoopi. She threw herself into the idea of creating something meaningful, a project that would dive deep into the messy, complicated parts of life without shying away from the hard questions. It wasn't just about faith or hope anymore. It was about connection, about giving people a space to share their stories raw and unfiltered without fear of judgment. Her team was skeptical at first. "You're sure about this?" her producer asked during one meeting, his brow furrowed as he flipped through the notes she'd handed him. "It's different, not your usual style." Whoopi leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "Yeah, I'm sure. Different is good. People are tired of surface-level conversations. They want real talk, stuff that makes them think, even if it's uncomfortable." Her assistant chimed in, nodding enthusiastically. "I think it could work. If anyone can pull off a series like this, it's you. You've got the personality for it." Whoopi smirked, raising an eyebrow. "Thanks for the vote of confidence. But yeah, let's give it a shot. Worst case scenario, we learn something along the way." And so the planning began. Whoopi spent hours brainstorming ideas, jotting down themes, and reaching out to potential guests. She wanted a mix of voices, people from all walks of life, who had faced challenges head-on and lived to tell the tale. Some were public figures, others ordinary individuals whose stories carried extraordinary weight. The goal wasn't to preach or provide easy answers, but to create a dialogue, a safe space where authenticity reigned supreme. One evening, while reviewing the guest list with her team, Whoopi found herself thinking about Karoline again. Their chance encounters had sparked this entire journey, and she couldn't help but wonder what role Karoline might play in the project. Was she ready to step into the spotlight? Or would she prefer to remain behind the scenes, quietly cheering from the sidelines? Deciding to take a leap of faith, a phrase she now found oddly fitting, Whoopi sent Karoline a text. "Hey, remember me? Got an idea I think you'll like. Can we meet up soon?" Karoline replied almost immediately. "Of course, always happy to hear from you. When and where?" They met at the same cafe where their first conversation had taken place. This time, though, Whoopi came prepared, with a notebook full of ideas and a nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. "All right," Whoopi said after they'd caught up briefly, diving straight into the reason for their meeting. "Here's the deal. I'm working on a new project. A series of interviews and discussions about life's big questions. Faith, doubt, pain, resilience, all that heavy stuff. And I want you to be part of it." Karoline blinked, clearly surprised by the invitation. Me? Really? Whoopi nodded firmly, leaning forward slightly. Yeah, really. You've got a perspective that's rare these days. Honest, grounded, relatable. Plus, our chats have already inspired half this thing. Figured it was only fair to include you. Karoline smiled softly, touched by the gesture. I'm honored. But are you sure? I'm not exactly a household name. Whoopi waved a hand dismissively. Doesn't matter. This isn't about fame or credentials. It's about sharing experiences that resonate. Trust me, you belong here. After some discussion, they agreed that Karoline would participate, not as the star of the show, but as a contributor. Her role would be to offer insights and reflections, drawing from her own journey while encouraging others to open up about theirs. As the weeks turned into months, the project began taking shape. Each episode featured candid conversations with guests ranging from activists and artists to teachers and stay-at-home parents. There were moments of laughter, tears, and everything in between. What tied it all together was the underlying theme. No matter how broken life seemed, there was always room for healing, and often it started with simply being heard. During one particularly memorable episode, a young man shared his story of battling addiction and finding redemption through community support. His words struck a chord with viewers, sparking an outpouring of messages from people who related to his struggles. Watching the impact unfold, Whoopi felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. This is why we do it, she told Karoline later, scrolling through the comments section during a break. Not for the likes or shares, but because it matters. Because someone out there feels less alone because of this. Karoline nodded, her eyes shining with pride. You've created something special here. Something real. Whoopi grinned, shaking her head modestly. We did. Together. By the time the final episode aired, the project had evolved beyond anything Whoopi had initially imagined. It wasn't just a TV segment. It was a movement, a reminder that humanity thrives on connection. And while she still approached faith and hope with a healthy dose of skepticism, she couldn't deny the power of belief. Not in religion necessarily, but in each other. In the end, it wasn't about changing minds or convincing skeptics. It was about planting seeds of understanding, one honest conversation at a time. And for Whoopi, that made all the difference.